The autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of the Grandview Country Club, casting a golden glow across the polished marble floors. Richard Thompson stood near the entrance adjusting his work uniform for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 58 years old, he had learned to take pride in his work as the club's head maintenance supervisor, even when moments like these reminded him of the distance between his world and the one inhabited by the members he served. He had worked at the Grandview for nearly 30 years. He knew every corner of the building, every quirk of the old heating system, every loose floorboard that creaked when you stepped on it just right. The club had been his second home through the years that saw his children grow up and leave the nest, through the quiet, difficult period after his divorce, and through all the small joys and sorrows that make up an ordinary life. Today was the autumn charity gala, one of the most important events of the year. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and tables dressed in cream-colored linens. Richard had spent the past week making sure everything was perfect, checking the lighting, adjusting the temperature, testing the sound system. It was his job to remain invisible, to blend into the background, while the wealthy members enjoyed their evening. As guests began arriving in their elegant evening wear, Richard moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. He had developed a kind of radar over the years, sensing when someone might need assistance while knowing exactly how to make himself scarce when his presence might be awkward or unwelcome. That was when he saw her. Natasha Mitchell stood near the center of the ballroom, and the sight of her made Richard's breath catch in his throat. She wore a stunning red dress that seemed to capture every bit of light in the room. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and when she smiled at something her companion said, Richard felt transported back 35 years to a time when they were both young and the world seemed full of endless possibility. They had met in college, two kids from working-class families who had scraped together scholarships and student loans to chase their dreams. Richard had been studying business with vague hopes of one day running his own company. Natasha had been focused on art history with a passion that lit up every conversation. They had fallen deeply in love in that intense, all-consuming way that only the young can manage. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After graduation, the weight of student debt and family obligations pressed down on them. Richard's father had fallen ill, and Richard had returned home to help support his mother and younger siblings. Natasha had received an opportunity to study abroad in Europe, an offer too good to refuse. They had promised to make it work, to write and call and find their way back to each other. The letters had come steadily at first, full of longing and hope and plans for the future. But slowly, over months and then years, the correspondence had faded. The distances between them, both physical and emotional, had grown too wide to bridge. Eventually, the letters stopped coming altogether, and Richard had accepted that Natasha had moved on with her life, just as he needed to move on with his. He had married someone else, a kind woman named Carol, who worked at the local library. They had raised two wonderful children together. The marriage had not been passionate, but it had been comfortable, steady. When Carol finally admitted that she had fallen in love with someone else, Richard had felt more relief than heartbreak. They had parted as friends, both acknowledging that they had tried their best. Now, standing in the ballroom watching Natasha laugh with a distinguished-looking older gentleman, Richard felt the weight of all those years pressing on his chest. She looked so at ease in this world of wealth and privilege. The man beside her had his hand resting lightly on her back in a gesture that spoke of comfortable intimacy. Richard turned to slip back toward the service entrance. This was not his world. He had no right to interrupt her evening, no claim on her attention after all these years. But fate had other plans. As he moved through the crowd, he accidentally bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Richard reached out instinctively, steadying the tray before the glasses could tumble and shatter across the marble floor. "Careful there," Richard said quietly, helping the young man regain his balance. The small commotion drew attention. Several guests turned to look, and among them was Natasha. Their eyes met across the room, and Richard watched as recognition dawned on her face. Her expression shifted through surprise, then wonder, then something else he could not quite name. She said something to the man beside her and began walking toward Richard. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think of anything except the fact that after 35 years, Natasha was walking directly toward him. "Richard?" she said when she reached him. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and musical, with that slight hint of laughter, always present just beneath the surface. "Hello, Natasha," he managed to say. "It's been a long time." 35 years, she said. "Give or take." They stood looking at each other while the party swirled around them. Richard was acutely aware of his work uniform, of the smudge of dust on his sleeve from checking the ventilation system earlier, of the vast gulf between her elegant presence and his serviceable reality. "You look wonderful," she said, and the sincerity in her voice made his throat tighten. "Thank you, so do you. You always did." The distinguished gentleman Natasha had been speaking with approached them. He was tall, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from a lifetime of privilege. "Is everything all right, darling?" he asked Natasha. Before she could respond, another club member, a pompous man named Bradford, whom Richard had always found particularly condescending, stepped forward. "Is this man bothering you, Mrs. Mitchell?" Bradford asked in a tone that made Richard's jaw clench. "I can have him removed if he's being inappropriate." The casual cruelty of the assumption that Richard must be causing trouble simply because of who he was and what he wore sparked something in Natasha's eyes. She turned to Bradford with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "This man," she said, "clearly is someone very important to me. In fact," she paused, looking at Richard with an expression that held both tenderness and determination, "tell him I'm your wife." The words hung in the air. Bradford looked confused. The distinguished gentleman looked startled. Richard felt his heart hammer in his chest. "What?" Richard whispered. Natasha reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm against his. "Not legally, of course," she said, speaking now to the small crowd that had gathered. "But in all the ways that mattered, Richard was my husband long before I met Charles. We were young and foolish, and life got in the way as it so often does. But I have never forgotten him. I have never stopped wondering what might have been if we had been just a bit braver, just a bit more willing to fight for what we had." She turned back to Richard, tears shining in her eyes. "I married Charles 15 years ago. He's a good man and I care for him deeply, but I think I owe it to both of us to be honest. You, Richard Thompson, were my first love. You were the one who taught me what it meant to be truly seen by another person, and I am not going to stand here and let anyone treat you as less than the remarkable man you are." The room had fallen completely silent. Even the string quartet in the corner had stopped playing. Charles, the distinguished gentleman, stepped forward. To Richard's surprise, he was smiling gently. "Natasha has told me about you," Charles said, extending his hand to Richard. "I've always known I was competing with a ghost. It's actually somewhat of a relief to discover that ghost is just a... Richard shook Charles' hand, still too overwhelmed to fully process what was happening. Natasha squeezed Richard's hand gently. "I'm not asking for anything from you," she said quietly. "I have a life and you have a life, and we're different people now than we were back then. But I needed you to know that you mattered, that what we had mattered, and that no amount of time or distance or circumstance can erase the mark you left on my heart." Richard found his voice finally. "You mattered too," he said. "You always mattered. I think about you more than I probably should, especially on autumn evenings like this when the light hits just right and everything feels suspended between what was and what might have been." They stood together, two people who had loved each other in another lifetime, holding hands in a room full of strangers who were now witnessing something raw and real and achingly beautiful. Charles cleared his throat gently. "Why don't you two catch up properly?" he suggested. "There's a quiet sitting room down the hall. Take your time. I'll handle the social obligations here." Natasha looked at her husband with gratitude and affection. "Thank you, Charles. You're a good man." "I try to be," he said. "And I'm secure enough to know that the heart has room for many kinds of love. Go, talk. You both deserve that." Richard and Natasha walked together to the sitting room. They sat on a comfortable couch, and for the next hour they talked. They shared the stories of their lives, the roads they had traveled, the joys and sorrows they had experienced. They laughed over shared memories and acknowledged with gentle honesty the mistakes they had made. "I should have fought harder for us," Natasha said at one point. "We both should have," Richard replied. "But we were so young. We didn't know yet that the truly important things are worth fighting for even when it's hard." "Do you have regrets?" she asked. Richard thought about his children, about the quiet satisfaction of his work, about the small moments of beauty he had found in an ordinary life. "I regret losing you," he said honestly. "But I don't regret the life I've lived. It's been a good life. Different than I planned, but good nonetheless." "I feel the same way," Natasha said. "Charles and I have built something solid together. We have a good partnership. But I'm glad we had this moment. I'm glad I got to tell you what you meant to me." When they finally returned to the ballroom, the party was in full swing. Charles approached them with 2 glasses of champagne, which he handed to Richard and Natasha. "To old love and new understandings," Charles said, raising his own glass. They toasted together, and Richard felt something inside him settle. The past would always be there, a part of who he was. But it no longer felt like an open wound. It felt instead like a treasured memory, something to be grateful for rather than something to mourn. As the evening drew to a close, Natasha hugged Richard tightly. "Thank you for being here tonight," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding me that the love we shared was real." "Thank you for seeing me," Richard replied. "For making sure I was seen." He watched as Natasha and Charles left the ballroom, her hand tucked into the crook of her husband's arm. She turned back once, giving Richard a smile that held everything they had shared and everything they had learned. Richard finished his work that night with a lightness in his heart he had not felt in years. The past had been honored. The present had been acknowledged. And somehow, in that simple act of recognition and Natasha's fierce insistence that their love had mattered, something had healed inside him. He drove home through the autumn night, thinking about how life rarely turns out the way we plan, but how sometimes, if we are very lucky, we get exactly what we need, even if it comes in unexpected forms. He thought about how love never truly disappears, it simply changes, shape taking on new meanings as we grow and change ourselves. And he thought about kindness, about how one moment of genuine recognition can heal wounds we did not even know we carried. The moon was full and bright as Richard pulled into his driveway. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new opportunities for small acts of service. But tonight he would sleep peacefully, knowing that he had been seen and valued and remembered. Sometimes that is all any of us really need, to know that we mattered to someone, that our presence in the world made a difference, however small. And in the quiet darkness, Richard smiled.